So some absolutely seismic changes are coming for Warhammer 40K. It looks like armies are going to be returning to basically a big unified force organisation chart, plus strategic reserves will be free, and they're doing some really funky things with allies. Let's talk through these new match play rules and see what's going to be coming to the game. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today we're talking about Games Workshop's latest preview for their Arks of Omen mission pack. A really interesting looking update to Warhammer 40k, which is going to have people building armies very differently. I think brings some really interesting feel-good factors to certain armies in the game, plus also some very weird changes, including things like Allied Leagues of Votann. All the news that Games Workshop is talking about today comes from this new book that they've just announced. It's called the Arks of Omen Grand Tournament Mission Pack, and it's basically the equivalent of the Warzone Nephilim Mission Pack. The main two things that are going to be inside it are going to be a new way to pick armies, plus things like rebalanced secondaries and redone missions, but it will be dropping alongside the usual season updates. There'll be a balanced data slate and points values updated that are done digitally. As with these rulebooks, they are technically optional. Technically they're meant at organised or tournament play, but at least in my experience, quite a lot of people generally tend to follow along, as a lot of people like to run armies that are compliant with the latest and tournament legal sets of rules. And honestly, I feel like the army construction rules out of this are quite cool, and I'll be looking forward to try them out. Obviously, the points updates and the balanced data slate tweaks are going to be some of the most interesting things of this whole update. We'll certainly cover them here on the channel, and talk about some of the winners and losers out of the various factions. This preview is really quite a big, hefty, rules-dense one, but basically the headline news is that there's going to be a new super detachment for choosing armies that looks like it aims to be applicable to every single faction in the game. It's basically a bit of a return to a unified force organisation chart, rather than a whole ton of different detachments within the book, and it really does look like a big shake-up, big pros and cons for several armies, some things that you won't be able to field anymore, and some things that have got a lot easier to field. Otherwise, the other major changes are that there are new allies rules. If this preview is correct, it looks like a whole load of allies are just out and out bans now, which I think will be irritating to many, but also a few slightly more niche cases arguably got a fair bit less restrictive, including Imperium Allied Leagues of Votann, which is pretty monumental in itself. Otherwise, there's free strategic reserves and rebalanced secondary objectives. Both of those are pretty cool as well. So first up, and certainly the biggest thing that we've had revealed, is this one standardised force organisation chart, the Arks of Omen detachment, which costs 0 CP and looks like a unified army. As best I can tell from their article and the video that they've put out, I don't think that they've confirmed that this will be the only way to run an army, but my suspicion is that if you play with the mission pack, this is the detachment that you'll probably need to use. It looks like they have thought it through quite well. It is applicable to every single faction in the game, and there's certain caveats and exceptions for the more unusual ones. My guess is that in the army construction section of the rulebook, they'll just say that yes, this is the army that you need to build with, and you're not allowed to build it with just standard battalions and things like you've done in the past. Moving through the detachment quickly, it's got the usual restrictions, saying that you basically all must be from the same faction, and you can't mix up, say, a bunch of Imperium units within the same one. They've all got to, say, be Adeptus Custodes or Iron Hands or something. And it also forbids things like the Tyranids keyword, just because that's technically the Hive Tendril units from Codex Tyranids versus Genestealer Cult, who also have the Tyranids keyword. Broadly speaking, the detachment restrictions haven't changed, and it's command point cost free. It looks like the idea of this book is that you don't pay any extra CP for detachments or fielding units, unlike how you've done in the past. To try and cover every army in the game, the detachment is rather complex. You've got to take at least one HQ unless you're a Knight's army. And then most interesting, it does feel like we're de-emphasising troops a bit. Other than objectives secured and things, there's no real incentive to take them over other force org slots. You get to build your core of your army around either 3 troops, 3 elites, 3 fast attack, 3 heavy support, or 3 lords of war. Perhaps the initial reaction to that is that, say, if you wanted to spam a bunch of heavy support, you could now get 6 of them without paying any command point tax whatsoever, even if you don't make the efforts to include a bare minimum of troops, and then you can fill out with a bunch of other exciting units. Maybe slightly mixed feelings on that one, as I feel that tying command points to troops wasn't the worst thing for the game. It means that a lot of armies actually fielded their basic foot troops, whereas now I feel a lot might just avoid them. Otherwise, after you've taken that mandatory selection of 3 of one of those types of units, you've then got the option for a further 9 troops, a further 0 to 3 elites, a further 0 to 3 fast attack, 0 to 3 heavy support, up to 3 lords of war, up to 3 HQs, up to 2 flyers and up to 3 fortifications, and then there's a special extra section for character elites units, which you can also take another 0 to 3 of, and dedicated transports, which you can include 1 of for each infantry unit in your detachment. Overall, I feel that this broadly does similar to what some armies might have done before with multiple detachments, though it might rein in the options of a few more edge case armies that are really spamming a whole load of one slot. As mentioned, I think that because this is so all-encompassing and it seems to be the primary focus of the mission pack, I'd guess that you'd have to run this rather than running your own combinations of battalions and things, though I guess it's not 100% excluded at this point. I feel like some army builds are going to lose and win from this, just for obvious winners. I'd say that if you want to build around, say, a Vanguard detachment with a whole bunch of elites, rather than paying 3 CP like you'd normally have to, you'd now get that command point free. It does, on the other hand, mean, though, that say if you really wanted to go heavy on fast attack and say spam multiple detachments to get more, you're now still going to be capped at a maximum of 6 choices per army, no matter what you do. The same will be true for heavy supports and elites, though elites have a little bit more wiggle room if they want to include some elite characters. The fact that there's basically no command point cost for any detachments now means that there's going to be a few more CP available for pre-game spend, if you wanted to buy in a whole load of relics and warlord traits, and you were playing an army that didn't really necessarily make sense to build around a battalion or patrol or something. It did feel just a little bit restrictive in Nephilim, either basically having to choose between certain detachments or getting some decent warlord traits and relics, so this might feel a little bit less punishing on army building in this way. Another notable change of it is that it technically helps out Imperial and Chaos Knights with army construction a bit. In their actual Codex rule with their Knight Lances, the rules are strangely restrictive of certain niche combinations of knights. Say, for example, if you wanted to run 2 Questoris and a Dominus, that would usually cost you more CP for some reason. Now Imperial and Chaos Knight armies can just mix and match any 6 Lords of War, so that basically gives them one more choice than they normally have access to, unless they wanted to shell out for a super heavy auxiliary support. Means that you might not need to squadron up quite as many armigers or war dogs. Broadly speaking, looks like fairly good news for them, I think. It also looks like very, very good news for any super heavy units in other factions that aren't Imperial Knights, say Eldar Wraith Knights, Orc Stompers or Imperial Guard Baneblades. If you say wanted to field 2 of them within your detachment, you'd be absolutely fine to now. You wouldn't run into arbitrary detachment limits, or if you wanted to run 3 of them, have to shell out a mighty 6 CP for no good reason. Provided you've got an HQ choice, then you can potentially just field them either as your mandatory or non-mandatory slots. On top of that, actually being in the main detachment will allow them to get regimental traits and things like that, so your Baneblades might be able to access Born Soldiers, or say Wraith Knights might be able to get the single hit reroll from Ulthway, which would be kind of handy on those heavy Wraith cannons. If you were playing a more regular army in Warhammer 40k and were running Lords of War, this Force Organisation slot just looks like a direct upgrade for them. As for things that are getting a little bit more restrictive, there are certain things that are going to be harder or impossible to build with armies now. If you use this force organisation slot, you're basically going to run into hard caps for many force organisation slots. You now can't run more than 12 troops, even if you took, say, a brigade and another detachment. You can't run more than 6 heavy support slots, again, even if you took a spearhead and something like a patrol. The same is true for fast attack and elites to some extent, though there's a bit more wiggle room with the character allowance. HQs is another one, only having 4 of those maximum will be annoying to some lists. Certain armies like to say use a battalion and a patrol and max out HQs in both. You're going to have to just choose your favourite 4 now. Lords of War maybe aren't so restrictive, that's arguably got easier for most armies, and the flyer cap restriction is basically being ported over from the balanced data slate into core army construction. You're only getting 2 of them in this, without any balanced data slate rules having to interfere. Another interesting thing about everything being lumped into one detachment is that there's no separate allowance for maximum of 1 characters, such as Hive Tyrants or Tower Commanders. These are instead allowed to double up a bit less restrictively than normal by paying an extra 1 command point tax, which we'll talk about in a stratagem in a second. For a lot of armies, this actually might make things easier for them, though I guess in theory you're never going to be able to run more than 2 of them. Say you couldn't have Tyranids and spam 3 different patrols to run 3 Hive Tyrants if you really wanted to. As mentioned previously as well, I do feel that this is actually a bit of a stealth nerf to troops. There's pretty much no incentive to really build around them as the core of your army now, besides just objectives secured and their own raw efficiency, unless they do some fairly heavy tweaks to points values in the game and make all the troops a bit cheaper as a result. I feel like in general a bunch of people are going to gravitate to the other bigger damage dealing force organisation slots and either take no troops whatsoever or take an extreme bare minimum of them for actions and things. With all the changes, all bear in mind that probably a lot of armies won't change enormously. If you had an army that had played around a battalion, then you'll probably stay the same, and if anything, just get a few more unrestricted options, probably less troops just for the ones that tended to take a bare 3 minimum and no more. And finally, just for some of the slightly more oddball armies in Warhammer 40k, both apparently Drukhari and Dark Angels will be getting their own special rules. They have their own detachment rules like the Drukhari multiple patrols, and I guess that Dark Angels will be getting something to represent their own unique detachments of Deathwing and Ravenwing, and I'd guess give them an option for getting objectives secured on those units within this detachment, though I feel like there's a few different ways that they could go with that. Overall, broadly speaking, I must admit, I think it's a quite fun change. I feel like a lot of people are going to prefer the simplicity of just building through one slot now. It feels like quite a cool way to potentially round out 9th edition, having some fairly de-restricted armies and going to town. Moving on, here we have the heroic support stratagem that we talked about. The text of this one basically reads that you use this before the battle, and when you're mustering your army, then if there's a rule that limits the number of times you can include a unit in your detachment to 1, you can include 2 of them instead for 1 CP. You can only use the stratagem once, and it specifically calls out Genestealer Cult Genesect as an exception. Unfortunately, no doubling up for the Genestealer Cult characters in any circumstances now. Might kind of suck a little bit if you're, say, building a list around maybe a couple of Magi and a couple of Kelemorphs in 2 different patrols or something. That just looks like it's no longer an option if you're playing with this one big detachment. I feel like this is quite a nice exception really, as it means that otherwise you'd never, say, be able to field anything like 2 Space Marine captains, which I don't think is unreasonable at a 2000 point level. And you do still have to trade out resources if you want to double up on the things that don't typically appear in droves. Perhaps out of some of the more notable examples that people might conceivably want to spend multiple detachments on. Tower Commanders are quite a common pick for having multiple detachments. They're really powerful, and it made Farsight Enclaves a pretty interesting choice by comparison. Though interestingly enough, this might be a bit of a nerf to Farsight Enclaves, as even with this stratagem, you're still going to be a max of 2 for the Farsight people. Might mean that Tau Sept has basically gained a major advantage that Farsight has. They only need to spend 1 CP to basically have the same commander allowance. Tyranid Hive Tyrants have arguably got a small buff with this as well. I'm sure Tyranids might get some points adjustments to compensate and stuff, but in theory it's pretty easy to have 2 Hive Tyrants winging around, or a Hive Tyrant and a walking one. Grey Knights have potentially struck it lucky with this one. Grandmaster Nemesis Dread Knights, in any circumstance you could only have 1 of now. Now in theory you should be able to have 2 for 1 CP. Custodian's Shield Captains are another option that would generally just made sense to field the 1 of. You could have 2 on the jetbikes if you wanted, or Terminator plus a jetbike 1 for 1 CP. Death Guard Lords, I feel like you could conceivably want multiple Lords of Contagion, and that wasn't really an option before. Now you could if you wanted, and you weren't as bothered by the Plaguecrasters. Chaos Space Marine Demon Princes might make sense. They're very fighty smash characters, and you could conceivably want more than 1. And also it's quite nice for Necron Catan Shards, as otherwise you'd just be limited to 1 per army, and again often people want to run more. Definitely no option for running 3 of them though, which I have seen in certain lists. Next up we've got the section on allied detachments, which I still think is an area that they need to clarify just a little bit more, as at the moment it's really unclear as to whether or not more generalised allies in Warhammer 40k are even going to be allowed in this detachment. They've called out some specific things. At least in the free text of the article, they basically say there's such a thing as an allied detachment, which now no longer cost any command points, which was the usual cost of including them in your army, but only certain armies can actually join your main one. They've got a section called Battle Brothers in the book apparently, which outlines some iconic partnerships in the 41st millennium. I'd say perhaps the biggest question for this one is whether or not that Arks of Omen's detachment is mandatory for all armies. If it is, then it sounds like there's at least a chance that more generalised allies within, say, Imperium armies might be out. I probably wouldn't get too worked up about this one way or the other though. It might be that you can just buy them in just the same way as before with command points, and then you just break your faction-wide special rules like you normally can. And the Battle Brothers section might be a lot more extensive than what they've let on here. They did say in the free text that these are just a taste of the rules in the Battle Brothers section, so it might be that, say, Imperium armies can ally just generally. So we really need more information on that front. If this is the whole Imperium section though, then it does look like the Allies section is pretty small. There's basically 3 different options listed here. An agent of the Imperium, either auxiliary support or Imperial patrol. I guess that'd be good for things like an Allied Inquisitor, or a little unit like, say, those Navy Breaches or something, seeing as it's now command point free. I'm still not sure it'd work for the Inquisitorial detachment though, as their force organisation slots are all elites and not troops at the moment, unless they do some shifting around. Otherwise, they've got a similar permission for Freeblade Knights, which you can basically already take, so 1 allied Freeblade Knight unit, whether it's a trio of Warglaves or something, or a big heavy Questoris. And lastly, definitely most surprisingly of all, Imperial armies can apparently take 1 allied Leagues of Votann patrol detachment, which is pretty mental in itself. That's definitely one that warrants a whole video, which I'll probably try and aim to cover later in the day. That's certainly got some pretty mad potential. Otherwise, it's kind of interesting to see the new Genestealer Cult Brood Brother allies section. Genestealer Cults can take Brood Brothers either as an auxiliary support or a super heavy auxiliary detachment. I think we'll still need an FAQ to see what sort of models they can take in those, but I would guess that anything that had the old regimental keyword, and probably not things like scions or special characters. Certainly looks interesting enough though for the Cult of the Four-Harmed Emperor getting their hands on Lehman Rosses or other fancy new guard tech. Otherwise, they've also mentioned the Thousand Sons getting a Tzeentch Legion's Demonica Patrol detachment, this one being a bit different to the rules described in Codex Chaos Demons, where you basically pay the command points and take a detachment up to a quarter of the power level. In some ways this is quite a lot better, as it will be command point free, but in some ways it's a bit worse. You wouldn't have quite the same option to spam certain units. I'd guess that Flamers are almost certainly going to be getting a big nerf in one way or another, so it might be a little bit less relevant, but otherwise it looks like Thousand Sons working with Tzeentch is pretty unrestricted now. As mentioned, they did say in the article that those three choices are not the full list. I'd say the biggest questions are whether or not other Imperial armies can ally to each other, and whether or not Nurgle demons can join in with a Death Guard army. I suspect that that would probably be the case, and other demons with Chaos Space Marines. Another question might be Supreme Command detachments, say Abaddon the Despoiler and other Chaos lists. I'd guess that Chaos might be quite likely to get an allied option for the Agents of Chaos, similar to the Imperium. Overall, pretty interesting stuff. I think that a fair few people will be pretty annoyed though if they basically just removed Imperial allies from the game, and particularly so if they're allowing allied leagues of Votann. It would just be a very, very strange situation where, say, for example, Space Marines couldn't be supported by a few Imperial Guard Auxilia, but for some reason they could be supported by some pretty much non-aligned Space Dwarves. Next up, and another pretty meaningful change to the game, are that strategic reserves are apparently going to be free in the next season. This now means that they're just going to be far more viable, as particularly in Nephilim CP was very, very squeezed, so often you either wanted to be spending it on warlord traits and things, or early game stratagems, not really giving you much incentive to shell out for expensive things outflanking the enemy. Having them basically completely unrestricted now means that you could put some hard-to-hide units guarantee an alpha strike in turn 2. Say for example, if you had a bunch of scary threatening ranged damage dealers like Lehman Russes, you could potentially have the few of them on the board that you thought you could hide behind terrain, and then say put another 2 or 3 of them in strategic reserve, have them turn up turn 2, and have them blaze away at hopefully a fairly ideal target with the lines of sight they should be able to get. Makes the option a lot more interesting for things like Space Marine Eradicators maybe, or Sister Retributors perhaps, other things that really want to get a line of sight on a key target and want to be safe from enemy return fire. Far more viable and less costly to have them reserve rather than putting them behind terrain. It could also be useful for cheap little units that you might want to do objectives and actions and things. Say if the new version of Retrieve Data is pretty usable, that could be good for chaff units turning up just to do that and then harass the enemy after. It does mean though that a few rules that mess around with command point costs for strategic reserve could be kind of redundant unless they update them with FAQs for new rules. Say for example the Eldar Webway Gates or the Imperial Guard Blitz Division regimental trait, both of them are half the cost for strategic reserves, and if strategic reserves are cost free, then both of those are going to be entirely redundant in this mission pack. Definitely interesting enough, and while a lot of things often want to start on the board turn 1 to get stuck into the enemy or take up threatening positions in the midfield, I feel like this will get used quite a lot. Otherwise, before we talk about a few mission things, they have confirmed a few bits and bobs that are going to be remaining from the Nephilim mission pack. First up, you'd still need to pay command points for Warlord traits and relics. It sounds like you'd still need to pay for them, including the first one, as you do at the moment. That one wasn't an enormously popular change when they brought it in, to be honest, but I feel like with the other changes that they've made, basically meaning that you don't have to shell out for command points for detachments or strategic reserves, it does mean that if you really want to go to town on Warlord traits and relics, you now feel a lot less bad about doing so. Maybe helps out some factions more so than others. Anything that comfortably built around a battalion or something still won't have much change from this, presuming they are keeping the command point limits the same. Still means that armies like Admech in that case wouldn't be able to go for crazy pre-game spends, spending like 10 CP pre-game, though hopefully Games Workshop will manage to make it up to them in other ways. They also say that fortifications remain easier to deploy. I guess that would be the retention of the special rule to allow you to swap out a terrain piece within your own deployment zone if you don't have room to set a fortification up. If that's true, then all well and good, but I still feel like it's a slightly weak special rule. Really, that not setting up within 3 inches of other terrain pieces in the game I think is quite restrictive for them, and on a lot of maps is still going to make them a very niche choice, or just something that you don't really want to play. They've confirmed that command point generation looks like it's going to be the same, likely 1 command point each player turn, and probably the same starting caps, seeing as they haven't specified otherwise. We'll have to watch that one, I guess, but otherwise I do quite like the 1 command point per player turn. It does mean that you use a few more defensive and reactive stratagems, as opposed to just going in for big alpha strikes, even though it can be a bit of a chore to keep track of. I've certainly seen myself and others often forget to add on the 1 in your opponent's turn. They've also kept the rule with dedicated transports needing to have a unit starting inside, rather than just buying in for the sake of them and then going off on their own. Kinda makes sense. It's still going to limit things like land speeder storms, which a lot of Space Marine players just wanted to play just for a fast unit to throw onto objectives. Now they still have to take their scouts. Finally, last but not least, we have a few changes to missions. They've been rather cagey as to details for this, but basically have confirmed 2 things. First up, they say that they've tweaked the timing on scoring primary objectives somehow. They didn't go into any detail on this whatsoever, but they say apparently it's something to do with the order of scoring them as a way of helping balance out first and second turn gameplay. Something that I kind of wonder whether or not they're just alluding to previous changes there. As in general, I don't feel that that's the biggest problem for Warhammer 40k at the moment. With the current pack, you've got the rule that if you go second, then you get to score your primary objective scoring at the very end of the game, which potentially gives you a big boost on turn 5 if you survive that long. I've not seen that as being a major criticism of Warhammer 40k scoring in quite a while, so I don't know if they really want to make any further changes to it. Otherwise, as expected, a big section of the book is likely to be on secondary objectives. The Nephilim ones I think were generally not too bad, though certainly there were some really big winners and losers out of some of the armies, some armies having almost crazily easy ones like Necrons that you really didn't want to compare, say, the generic Chaos Space Marine or Admech ones to, a lot of which absolutely sucked. First up, the main change for secondaries is that every army is apparently going to be getting 3 secondary objectives, no more, no less. That should add a bit of parity between the factions. It does mean that for a bunch of them with 4, I guess that means that they'll be deleting one of them. They say on top of that, the Space Marine chapters and the Chaos Space Marine legions also get an extra one. I don't know whether or not that means that Chaos and regular Space Marines will just get the 2 and then a bonus one, or whether they'll get 3 and the Legion one will be indeed extra. If the latter, then that would be going against the idea of every faction getting 3, but it's not necessarily the biggest problem in the world if the Chaos Space Marine or Space Marine ones remained kind of bad. From the way that they've worded it, I do feel like the extra one is just literally going to be the extra one that they already have from the previous mission pack. I don't think that every Chaos Space Marine Legion or chapter will be getting an extra 2. They have previewed a couple of those, the one for the Salamanders and the one for the Emperor's Children, both of which have seen some small tweaks. The Emperor's Children, Adorn the Canvas Eclectic, was one for trying to kill more units, more characters, and hold more objectives. Previously, this one was a bit of a low yield one, to be honest. You would generally score at least a few points with it, but you'd be very unlikely to max it. Now it looks like it's done a bit of a turnaround. Each turn you literally just need to try and hold more, kill 1 in melee and 1 at range, and then that'll get you 3 victory points per turn, plus any other characters that you kill with an Emperor's Children character would also net you a victory point as well. I feel like that's gone from one that's really quite bad to one that's very usable indeed, particularly against armies that have loads of characters or multiple small units. The Salamanders one, as best I can tell, seems to have been slightly nerfed. This one was one where you just put a tanky infantry squad on one midfield objective, and then you get victory points for surviving on that objective, and also more victory points when it kills things or an enemy unit fails to kill it. This one has been very slightly toned down, though is broadly the same in terms of spirit. They can only get a maximum 2 victory points for your infantry units surviving the enemy attacks each turn, which still seems very doable, as you're still likely to rack up the points if your opponent tries to repeatedly gun you off it. Overall, they both seem usable. I do feel that Games Workshop has got a lot they can do to rebalance the game with the secondary objectives. They are a major problem for some of the armies that are struggling, and maybe a little bit too easy for some of the ones at the top of the meta. So overall, rather a lot to process. Broadly speaking, I feel like this is generally some pretty awesome changes. Definitely going to be posing some new interesting puzzles to unlock, and I'm sure that we'll be seeing people building armies in some very different ways. Broadly speaking, I like the new force organisation chart and the fact that you're not going to be trying to spend loads of CP pre-game. In particular, for the faction-specific super heavies, I think it's a big win. I perhaps feel that they probably should have emphasised troops just a little bit more than they have. Might mean that we don't see anywhere near as much of them in lists going forward. For allies rules, I think I'll reserve judgment. I think it is pretty strange to be having Votan units allied to Imperium, particularly if other Imperial forces are a bit more restricted. I guess we'll have to wait and see the full news on that front. Strategic reserves being free I think is pretty reasonable, something that they could have done at the start of 9th edition if they'd wanted. Again, the rules look pretty tempting and usable, and it's going to be a big decision each game when you're playing your opponent, what sort of stuff makes sense to put in reserve to give you more of an advantage. Finally, the mission changes I think are broadly going to be positive. I've usually been tweaking these for the better each time, and secondary objectives are certainly a way that they can make the game a bit more balanced at a competitive level. I'll be really interested to hear your guys' thoughts on it though. Are there any other big implications that I might have missed from this? And what do you like or dislike about these proposed changes? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly aim to cover any more 40k rules news, and I'll be looking forward to going over this book and the points costs in detail once we get the update. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention as well that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you're interested. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits every month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.